Today we're going to be talking about what's new in Project Online and also Project Server 2013. So we'll sort of talk about some of the features of the online product, but also for those of you that are running on premises, we'll be talking about the March update, which should release later today. And some of this stuff I think Monica's already covered. We're recording the session. There's the link to the YouTube. Adrian and I will try and answer questions as we go along, the one who's not speaking. If we don't get to all of the questions in the time as well, and we will come back to the questions at the end, or if there's any that we can't answer, then we'll probably take those offline, and I'll probably post up a sort of resume of those questions and answers on my blog over the next few days. And I've already said most of that. So we'll go over to the introductions. I'll hand over to Adrian to introduce himself.
Well, thank you, Brian. My name's Adrian Jenkins, and I've been at Microsoft for 25 years now. So I'm kind of old, in computer terms at least. And I've spent most of my time working with project. In fact, over the course of that 25 years, I've spent one portion or another either supporting project, working on the product itself, designing things, or whatever it happens to be. So I do focus a lot on the hot fixes that come in, also future directions and so forth.
Thanks, Adrian. And I'm an escalation engineer as well, do the same kind of role as Adrian. I haven't been at Microsoft for 25 years. I'm probably just about half the length that Adrian's been here, but I'm old in any terms, computer or otherwise. So the first part of this, we'll talk about what's new in Project Online. And there's a few changes that are sort of coming up. Some of these you may have seen already, some of them you'll see soon. And sometimes that depends on which tenant you're in, because these things sort of tend to roll out over a number of days, sometimes a couple of weeks. So it can sometimes take a little while for you to sort of see some of these things happening. The first change I'm going to mention is a change to a new superpower that you're going to have if you're a site collection administrator. And one of the challenges we've seen with Project Online, and has caused us some support issues as well, and obviously cause customers some delays in getting access to system, is they might accidentally take themselves out of the administrators group in project, and then they can't go back in to add themselves to the administrators group because they're not an administrator anymore. That can also happen if you're sort of syncing to a group and you're not in the group, and nobody else who's available is in the group. So one of the changes we've made is that any site collection administrator in your tenant will have direct access to Project Web App functionality as an admin. So you'll be able to fully administer the instances, and it doesn't actually check the project permissions for those site collection administrators. So it is sort of a super user in that sense. Even if you go into project and deny that particular person particular functions, they would still have access. So it's designed that way so that we don't sort of get these lockout situations where you then have to contact Microsoft to get somebody pushed back into the administrators group with all of the delays that can cause you. The second item I'm going to mention is performance. We've got ongoing work on this. We did roll out some pretty major changes early in February, and I've certainly had feedback that some of you noticed those. Some of you may have not noticed those because we didn't push them out to sort of all farmers. We're doing a little bit of A/B testing on some of these particular rollouts just to gauge how successful they are before we sort of push them out to everybody. A lot of these particular changes that went out in February hopefully would deal with some of the just sort of slow page loads you've seen, particularly when you haven't used Project Web App for a while. So if you've sort of been using it and then you stop for a couple of hours and you go back, sometimes that first page load could be really painful and slow. And we've done a lot on the sort of page warm up and pinging the pages to try and sort of keep them active and in cache and all that kind of thing, so that makes the experience a lot better. The other work that we're continuing to do is to analyze the usage of Project Online across all of our tenants, and then see where our efforts are best spent in terms of improving performance. So, we can see all of the ASPX pages that people are touching, we can see all of the queue jobs that run, and we can see which ones are causing the most sort of delays and see where the most time is spent. So we tend to sort of use that as our basis for, where do we need to do some work? Is it the project center loading? Is it the approvals page? And we concentrate on the high hitters, the ones that are taking a while but are used very regularly. So if there's like an admin page that you'd only use once in a blue moon and it's a little bit slow, then it's probably not one that we're going to get to that quickly in terms of improving the performance on that. We're really targeting the pages that everybody uses every day for that one. Another piece of feedback we've had on the support side is the performance of OData. And there is a best practices document, and I put the link into the presentation there, which gives some guidance for how you can get the best out of OData. And some of that is using SQL Server integration services so that you can sort of pull data to either a local or a cloud-based SQL Server for ongoing reporting. Some of it is around filtering the data as well, because if you sort of hit just OData with Excel and you're expecting it to pull every single record in your table straight to you, it's not going to be a great experience in terms of the amount of time it takes to get that data. So you probably want to filter on something like filtering on a project, that kind of thing, to get the best experience. The final one on this page, we've got a PWA quota increase. And initially, Project Online was sort of turned on, and you could have up to 3 PWA instances in each of your tenants. So it sort of gave you a chance to sort of have perhaps a dev test and a live system. As we sort of moved through and improved the performance and capacity of the system, we've switched everybody up to 7 now. We initially turned it on for new tenants to get 7. We've been right back through the farm and increased all of them from 3 to 7 now as well. On a case-by-case basis, we will take or we'll consider if you need a couple more beyond the 7. So, don't think that 7 is necessarily a hard limit if, for instance, you just need that one extra test system, something like that. The overall quota in terms of the space used by Project Web App comes under your total SharePoint quota. So, it is not designed for you to have 7 live active huge systems, or if you wanted to increase to 15 and they were all going to be big active live ones, we probably wouldn't accept that request to increase. But if you had sort of a request for 15 where each of them was a particular department where you wanted to use a project in a small way, or if you wanted extra ones for doing some testing, then that's normally the kind of thing that we would consider, because it wouldn't hit your sort of overall SharePoint quota limits. One of the questions we've had is on resource quota, which is something you can allocate to any website within, or site collection within SharePoint Online, as well as Project Online. This doesn't actually do anything for project in terms of performance. We did have a case with one customer that had thought they'd seen a difference when they increased it up to 2,000. They saw one of their thought they saw one of their PWAs was working faster, but that may have coincided with the changes we made at the beginning of the month. The resource quota, and there's documentation up on the web about it, is more for sandbox solutions where you're sort of allocating resource for your own applications in a sandbox environment on different site collections. So just thought I'd mention that one in there as well.
Hey, Brian.
Yes, Adrian.
While we're on this page here, on OData, we're actually going back through and trying to make that better. So there's certainly the SSIS solution and so forth, but we've recently changed some architecture on the servers itself that will allow us to do larger page sizes. Currently in the OData, let's say you want to receive 400 rows. Well, it's going to receive no more than 200 at a time, and so each one of those calls is distinct. It brings it in, assembles it, pulls it down to the client, and so forth. And so just kind of the think of it as a packet size on the network. The smaller the packet size are and the more of them that you do, sometimes the slower things get simply because you're just doing so much. So we're going through right now and doing some testing to try to figure out what is the optimum packet size or page size that we can make OData work with without affecting, multiple people on the server and so forth. So we hope to have some better results even because of that testing and that work that we're doing.
That's great news, and I'm sure we can put something out on the blog when we sort of get to a point of making those changes as well, just to let everybody know that that's happening. The next page, I'm looking at what's coming up in Project Online, and this is information that comes from the Office 365 roadmap, and the link is there. So these are all sort of publicly announced things that we've said we're working on. Top one there, apps for Project Pro for Office 365. We're adding write support for that. So far, the apps for Project Pro have been able to pull information out of your project, but they haven't been able to do any sort of write back to be able to sort of modify one task based on the information it gets from somewhere else. So that's a big change there. I think it'll be very good for the app developers working on the client side. We're adding some capacity management capabilities in Project Online as well. So resource managers can sort of see where utilization is actually happening. So have some heat maps there, which will sort of show the hotspots of your overutilized resources, so that resource managers can drill in and work out how they need to look after those resources. So rather than on a project by project basis, sort of a higher level view of that. And we did accidentally turn on some of the ribbon for capacity management in the last couple of weeks. So I know certainly a few of you have seen this sort of weird icon show up, and on the I think it was on the one of the resource management pages, and clicking it wasn't a great experience because the stuff behind it isn't sort of built in and working yet. So we have now, or in the process of removing that if it hasn't already gone from your tenant. So just a glimpse of something to come that you shouldn't really have got and wouldn't have been very valuable, but that's the feature that's going to be coming down the line. Another one on the client side, we're adding the ability to have multiple timeline bars in Project Pro for Office 365. So now you'd be able to have, if you had 3 phases in your project, you'd be able to present the tasks in those phases on 3 different timeline bars. So it's one timeline control with 3 bars in the timeline itself is the naming we're using. So you'll be adding timeline bars rather than adding new timelines. The final one, penultimate one on this line, on this slide, resource engagement workflow is going to be added to Project Online as well. So this ties nicely into the capacity management one and allows for an engagement to be sort of requested by the project manager. So he can say, okay, I want Adrian Jenkins for 3 months starting in April, and then the resource manager can say, well, I'm sorry, you can't have Adrian for 3 months, you can have him for 2 months, and I've got somebody else you can have for the other month. So you have this kind of workflow between the project manager and the resource manager to get that sort of engagement information happening. As we get close to release of these, there'll be a lot more information posted up, obviously, onto the web. And certainly if you're going to the Ignite conference in Chicago, a lot of these features will be covered at that conference. The final one, which isn't sort of anything new, but I added it just at the bottom of this slide just as a reminder to mention this. We've seen a few issues where customers have sort of started using Project Online and got users active in it and done quite a bit of stuff in it, and then decided, oh yeah, we'd like to have a vanity domain, and then change their domain so all their users suddenly have a different account, and that account doesn't match up to the one that they started life with in Project. That's not a good experience, and in fact going in later and trying to change the domain is firstly, it's an unsupported scenario because just changing it in Project doesn't necessarily change all the behind the scenes stuff that original user had access to. So it's really good to plan your domain naming before you start with Project Online, so that you get the sort of best experience there and sort of don't run into issues where you end up with 2 Brian Smiths, one in .briansmith .onmicrosoft.com and another one at briansmith.com or something like that. So just some sort of more general advice there on how to start in Project Online. I'll hand over to Adrian now, who will take you through the March updates, which should be out today.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so this first slide here just tells us about a slight change in the delivery mechanism. You may have noticed with the February update that it's now a public update, and part of that meant that you would just have that available for you in the download center, Windows Update and so forth. Those updates would be there, and that's really good for some of the client fixes and so forth, but we received some immediate feedback that said for the server updates that probably wasn't the best thing. Now, many of you don't have your server set up to automatically get all the updates and so forth, and so it wouldn't have affected you, but had you done that, these updates would have been applied to your server, and then you would have been going through an update process without you really knowing about it or necessarily wanting it at that time. So what we're doing now is that for the starting with the March updates here, it's going to be that it'll be available on the download center, but it's not going to be an automatic thing for you. Okay, so for the March updates, as I was going through this list here and trying to figure out what should we talk about, you're probably thinking, well, we haven't had one of these sessions here for a number of months, and so there's the February update, there's the December update, and so forth. And I thought about, well, how can we put all of those updates onto this slide as well? And I really couldn't find a good way to do that without making this an extremely long webcast and perhaps even boring you. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the March updates exclusively here. Now in the future, we'll try to find some way that perhaps we can include updates from previous public updates that we may have not already addressed. The first one here is baseline actual contour changes when the plan is inserted into a master plan. So let me just give you kind of a scenario behind this. Let's suppose that you have a number of projects, and in some of those projects they use a calendar that's different than perhaps the calendar that the master project is using. So maybe it's using a 24-hour calendar, or maybe a 7-day week calendar, or 7-hour per day calendar, whatever it happens to be. What was happening is that when you inserted that project into the master project, the baseline actual work contour would actually change. And so instead of having maybe 7 hours on a day, it would change it to some other value. And what was happening here is that once this information was brought into the master project, it was using the calendar of the master project to show what the baseline work should be. And of course that was incorrect because it should have been using the calendar from the sub-project itself. So it wasn't a corruption in the sense that the data was totally wrong or bad, because if you went back to the sub-project itself, it was still okay. It's just that when you viewed it from the context of the master project, that it certainly didn't look correct. Now just a little bit of information here. You'll see the little asterisk that says this has already been fixed in Project Online, and then you see this one here where it says just. Well, this particular fix here is just here in this update. Now, since this is a client update, whether you install Project 2013 or you get the Office 365 Office 365 edition, which is really just a SKU that allows you to install it differently. In that case, you'll get these updates just as a matter of course of installing either your public update or just updating your client. The second item here is task summary name and a few other fields are not populated in PWA when the plan is in draft mode. Okay, so what does this mean? So if you were to go to the Project Center and drill into a project, there are certain views. Some of them are assignment views, for example, and when you inserted certain fields, and one of those happens to be the task summary name, and let's say you also chose to edit the project, that's what's known as draft mode, because you're now actually editing that project and you're not just seeing the published version of the project. In that case, there were a few of these fields that just were not populating correctly. Some of the fields were, is the resource type, whether or not the resource is a budget resource, and also whether or not the resource is generic. So this was a very simple problem where the project calculation service, which is on the server there itself and is what actually calculates the project, it was not reading in the information. Therefore, when you were in the draft mode, these fields would be blank and you just couldn't use them. Now, things like the resource type and maybe resources budget, that's not as big of a deal as the task summary name. The task summary name allows you to show which summary task this given assignment is associated with. So if you have a big long list of assignments that you own, they may all be assigned to tasks that have essentially the same name, and the only way that you can really tell them apart is to look at the summary task under which they have been assigned. And so that's what this field was originally added for, and in this particular scenario it just wasn't showing up properly, so we've now addressed that issue. The third item here, can't filter on nullable Boolean using OData. That sounds very computer science-ish to me. What does this mean? Well, if you're using OData, it means that you were not able to find out or do a filter on fields that could have either true, false, or nothing. So in Project Professional, for example, we have a lot of flag fields. And by default, if you look at a value, it says false, okay, meaning it's not true, the opposite of that. But what you may not realize is that in the database itself, until you actually set it to true or false, it's actually null. So it doesn't have any value at all. And so there were a lot of these fields, flag fields in that people were trying to filter on with OData, and they had a null value. And there was no way to reconcile that with OData, and so it would come back with an error as a part of your query. And so now we allow you to filter that out to say, hey, for example, find me all of those tasks where the value is null, or find me all of those tasks where the value is true or false, or whatever the case may be. This is in the service. In fact, we had this fix in the service for quite a while, and to make it on premise and so that we have a consistent experience for people who have solutions that are both on premises and online, we move this fix into the on premises environment as well. The third to the last one here, rolled up task notes from status updates get truncated. I opened up this bug, and what I did is I put the, to show the example itself, I used Lincoln's address at Gettysburg. And so I had that text in there, and I added it to a note in task statusing. I then sent that note to the status manager, who then approved it. And what you should see once you look in the project is on that task, within the notes, you should see that entire Gettysburg address. So what was happening here is that after a couple of these updates, it was actually truncating the previous notes. And so instead of being a cumulative note, you were getting kind of a rolling note. And so we've now adjusted and fixed that problem. Second to last item here, project hangs when trying to level a project. Well, the description is pretty descriptive. There were some conditions under which you would try to level a project, and this was most common when you're leveling on a weekly or, weekly, yeah, pretty much on weekly basis, a little bit on daily basis as well. There was just some conditions within the leveling algorithm, and what it does is it tries to merge towards a common to see whether or not it's actually making progress. And so as the leveling works, it does that by adding delay to assignments, delay to tasks. It just keeps on moving things out. And as a part of that process, it does a calculation to say, hey, have I done any good here? And if I haven't done any good, then I need to keep on doing what I've done. And in this case here, it never got out of that loop because it wasn't properly checking for what it had done and how it was doing it. And therefore, it was just in an endless loop. the last item on this page, can't lock down tasks that were migrated from 2010 to 2013. So let's suppose that you have a server in 2010 and you decide to move to project server 2013, so you do that. In 2010, the way that you lock down a task to prevent people from adding more progress to it is you went to an admin page and you went through this little funky page where you had a little grid and you selected the task that you wanted to lock down. You did so, and then you saved it. In 2013, we've changed that model so that a project manager can go into the project center, drill into their project, and then directly while they're editing the project, set the value in the lockdown field to no, yes or no. And what was happening here is that when you're editing the project in Project Server, which is where you do this lockdown process, it was using the project calculation service. Well, the project calculation service itself doesn't quite know about the lockdown field. That property or that field is not something that you see within Project Professional. And the project calculation service is an instance of Project Professional running on the server. Well, what was happening here is that when you had the 2010 project, it didn't have that property in it that said it was locked down. Therefore, you would make the change, it would go in, the project calculation service would say, okay, I'm going to save all this stuff, but it hadn't actually updated or upgraded the project file itself to include the lockdown field. Therefore, any of those changes you made were lost. So now the project calculation service knows that it needs to upgrade the file as a part of that process to include the lockdown field if it doesn't already exist, so that your changes are saved. Okay, the next page here. The first item, project calculated on server causes wrong start dates on task. This fix actually originated in Project 2010. So the fix request was there in 2010, and we released the fix for that in the February update. And as a part of the process of doing that, we try to take the fixes there and then migrate them into the current version. So this one was specific to the project service interface, or the PSI. So let's suppose you have an application that calculates the project. And as a part of that, what was happening is that in some cases, you didn't get the same exact results when it was calculated there versus what you got in Project Professional. And part of that was simply because it wasn't taking into consideration a link going into a summary task, which then had these other tasks that had start relationships and so forth. So it wasn't a really common type scenario, but it was something that the calculation service, the project server calculation wasn't taken into consideration. Second item here, items count does not get updated for the task list in a filtered view. I believe, Brian, you wanted to speak to this one?
Yes, certainly, Adrian. This is a fix we did a short while ago in Project Online, and it introduced an issue there. The basic scenario around this one is that you've got a task list on your SharePoint site. It might be the project task list, but it could just as well be any task list that you've added to a site in SharePoint Online, even without project even existing on that system, because the task list is it's a feature that projects sort of own and put out there, but it comes with SharePoint Online as well as with Project Online. So you might have a count of items in the list, and you might filter it and have a sort of filtered view. And we weren't updating the count correctly. So we fixed that, but we basically broke something that was probably a little bit bigger than that, in that you can't now filter in your views. So if, for instance, you go to your task list and you click for the view for My Tasks, and you just expect to see your tasks, you'll find that you see all of the tasks. So whether it's a built-in view like My Tasks, or whether you create a custom view where you want to filter on a particular column within that task list, we're not filtering correctly. Now, we've got the fix for that in Project Online, and that is being sort of pushed through probably over the next few days, couple of weeks. Unfortunately, we haven't got the fix into the March PU, so I'm sort of telling you about the fact that we've fixed it for online, but unfortunately, what we've released in the March update will fix one problem but create a slightly different problem for you. So I'm sorry about that. Back over to Adrian.
Thanks, Brian. So the third item here, view project site permission does not work properly. Well, how does it not work properly? Let's suppose that you create a category and also you add that to a group and so forth, and then you set this property to deny. So your goal here is to prevent people from actually going to project sites. Well, the deny permission was totally ignored, and therefore there was no way to fully block people from getting to a site by using the deny. As we started looking at this, we realized, well, this happened because of a lot of work that we did in 2013. So in 2013, we changed and basically rewrote the user synchronization methods that we use to put users onto sites and onto the root site and so forth. And this was somehow it was missed, and so we started looking at it, and then we realized, wow, this is going to be really, really difficult to fix because everything that we tried seemed to make performance a lot worse than what it was. So we went back to the drawing board a little bit and did a lot of hard work, and thankfully in the end we've made not only the normal case much, much faster, but we also made this case work and also fast enough. So when I say fast enough, the test that we were doing, and this was with thousands of users and sites and so forth, it was taking originally about a minute for the user sync process to work. So it was actually going through, and the SQL query was spending time to figure out what they're supposed to be doing and so forth. And so that was taking about a minute. And so then we said, well, if we just add this this permission here to say, well, what happens when we set the deny? It was taking about a minute 30, and we said that's not going to work for anyone. And so after this fix now, it's taking about 10 seconds for the non-deny permission to go through, and then about double that for the deny. So we were able to get permission, or to get performance better across the board, and also to include the feature as it was intended to work. Okay, the next one, using PWA in a task view, multiple select custom fields lose selections and so forth. So let's suppose that you have a custom field. It's a task field, and you have a lookup table associated with it, and you also allow multiple selections on that lookup table. Now, if I'm in a task view and I'm the team member and I'm selecting some values for that field, what would happen is that if my list separator in SharePoint wasn't a comma, then it would actually cause an error, or it would lose the selection that I had made. So if I had selected more than one item, then it would lose the subsequent items. So if I selected 3, I'd end up with 1. If I selected 2, I'd end up with 1. And that's simply because of the way that it was taking the list separator and interpreting that as a string, and then sending that to the calculation service to say, here, this is what the user has. Go ahead and either save this information, change the information, or whatever the case may be. So we've adjusted and made that change. Second to the last item here, assignment units multiplied by 10 if Windows decimal separator is not a period. So think of the scenario where think about within project, and you go to the resource sheet, and there you can set up a resource, and you can say what are the maximum units for that person. I could have 1.5 units of something, or 2 units, or whatever the case may be. And when I make the assignment to a task, I can also specify the number of units that I want. And so if, suppose that I had a person, I wanted them to be assigned for a half a unit, okay? It would multiply that half a unit by 10, and then I would get 50. So I'd have 50 units of that person, and but the problem here was that it was not properly taking that decimal separator of a period or the non-period itself and recognizing is, and it was just taking that raw number, multiplying it by 10, and that's what it was giving you. So we've adjusted and made that fix. The last one on this page is task calendars lost when projects created from a template in PWA. We've also we're also shipping the exact same fix in Project 2010, and let me describe this scenario to you. Let's suppose that you have a template that you want your project managers to use. So they go to the project center, they go to the new button, and they choose the particular enterprise project template that you choose for them. And as a part of this template, it's part of the EPT is associated with a template. And so when they're done, they should see a list of tasks, and then they can take that list of tasks and assignments and resources and so forth and expand it out into their own project. Suppose also that within the project, you had calendars associated with the task. So I could have let's say a 24-hour calendar associated with the task. When you had that situation where you had a calendar associated with the task, when you created that project on the server, you would open it up and there would be no calendar at all associated with the task. In fact, the calendar wouldn't even be there. Therefore, if you had a task that relied on that calendar to give you certain attributes like duration, finish, and so forth, it would be totally different because it would just choose the task calendar. So if I had a calendar 24/7 and then suddenly it's using the project's calendar, which is 5 days a week for 8 hours a day, I would get a much different schedule on that task. So we've now addressed this problem. Now, interestingly, the problem was there in Project 2007 and 2010, so it's been there for a very long time. We had a customer recently who was using it this way, and they, for whatever reason, this was very important to them, and we decided, yes, that's an important scenario that we really need to support, and so we added the support for that. So those are all of the fixes that are in the March update that's coming out hopefully today, and we'll go to the resources page.
Thanks, Adrian. So I've put together a few sort of resources up here, repeated the Office 365 roadmap. So on that page, you can sort of see what's coming through, not just on Project Online, but also the whole of Office 365. So it's sort of grouped into areas of sort of what's coming, what's already deployed. If things get cancelled, we also note it on there as well. I think some of the forms over list stuff was the only item on the cancelled so far. I've also put the link there to the Getting Started Project Online, which should be Getting Started in Project Online. So my apologies for the typo there. So that sort of covers the various scenarios of actually signing up for Project Online, giving licenses to people, downloading Project Pro for Office 365, the really common scenarios that we're finding that customers are struggling with. So that content will really walk you through getting going with Project Online. I've linked to a couple of different blogs there. There's the project support blog, and if you haven't seen it, I've also on the top right hand side of that blog, I've added separate pages for lists of all of the fixes. I haven't added the March update to those lists yet. I will be doing that over the next day or two, and also updating those with the database versions and all of those things, which I tend to do from the actual live released product, so that I know that I'm getting exactly the same numbers that you should be getting out in the field. So that's a useful reference. You can sort of search right across all of the fixes, for example, on Project 2013, and see, okay, what's been fixed on baselines, and you can see every fix going back right to RTM that we've done on those particular products. And then I've put my own blog there as well. I tend to do most of the posting on the project support blog for, I suppose, the more official things. Occasionally I'll do postings on the Bryce Smith blog that are I guess more sort of semi-official, or I'd probably dare to say they're unsupported things that we appreciate that customers still need to do. So it's giving you a way out and a way around things that isn't necessarily a documented official TechNet way to do something, but needs must in some cases. One example that I'll probably be posting over the next couple of weeks is some details about the domain changing that I was mentioning earlier on, in terms of, okay, for on-premise, for example, as well. Perhaps you've done an acquisition, you've incorporated some stuff together, you've changed a name. How do you then go in and sort of change the names and the accounts of the resources that you got there? And then the final part of the resources, I've listed the 5 different forums we've got up on TechNet. We tend to use TechNet as our main place for answering questions. We do get questions posted in some of the Office 365 forums as well, but just in terms of the volumes of questions, we find that most of them tend to come to the TechNet forum. And it's almost a sort of self-fulfilling thing then, because if you're searching on Bing or Google, chances are you're going to find somebody who's asked a similar question, and it'll be on the TechNet forum. So the traffic tends to get driven to those forums, so that's where both Microsoft people and a lot of our great MVPs are answering questions for everybody. You can ignore the fact that it says 2010 in most of the URLs. That's just when we switched over from news groups to forums, and I guess somebody thought it was a good idea to put 2010 in there as it was a current version. But it's the same forum for all releases, all versions. Top one's for online, then we have sort of the client one, the server general one, customization and programming, and the bottom one is more about sort of deployment, installation, setup type stuff. So it just leaves me to thank you all for attending.